nation's leading experts on any topic to kind of help guide your thinking, to offer context in a way that really stays true to the evidence and the research and the science behind those, but also in ways that everybody can understand. And Gary, I think, is a prime example of kind of what makes that organization so strong. If you were here 2 years ago, you'll remember Gary also spoke. The theme that year was the Common Standards Movement, which has a very strong thread related to international issues, and so it's great to have Gary back again today. Gary has been at AIR and works on a wide variety of kind of large-scale assessment issues, especially related to kind of how the U.S. and international assessments compare to one another. Prior to joining AIR, as you may remember, if you know Gary, Gary was at NCES in the Department of Education, National Center for Education Statistics, for a while, and served in a variety of posts, including acting commissioner and deputy commissioner. And one of his primary responsibilities during those times was the center's large-scale assessment programs, including the international ones like PISA and TIMSS. So he is just the right person to offer a little bit of perspective on how we look internationally to provide a yardstick for American education. And so, welcome, Gary.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here and to also represent AIR. What I want to do is, I have just a few moments, I want to maybe talk about the importance of international yardstick, which I will call international benchmarking, and talk about what probably some of the impediments to it are, and the reason why, even though we in Washington sort of resonate to it, when you get down in the weeds into the districts and the states, they don't resonate to it. I'd like to maybe try to explain that. First, what is international benchmarking? Well, a simple example is if you want to make an American car, you're going to want to benchmark the quality and performance of that car to the best in the world, because you know that you're going to be competing with the best companies in the world. And if you don't do that, you pretty much know that you're not going to succeed in that business. Well, let's take an example in education. If you are building a curriculum in your state or your district, or you're setting a passing standard, wouldn't you expect your students to learn and be competitive with the best in the world? Because you would probably believe that in the future these students are going to compete with the best in the world for college and for career. It's no accident that when your students go to college, there will be a lot of Asian students from Singapore and places like in Finland sitting in the room, and these are the students that they will have to compete with. This is what international benchmarking is. There are, I believe, two impediments to this, which, again, in Washington, you may not see this because you tend to have a more global view of things. But in the states and the districts, this will be more and more true. In my recent years at AIR, I've done a lot of work in the states and the districts, and I've been shocked, really, at some of what I've seen. I think the first big impediment to international benchmarking is education itself. American education is in a kind of a pre-scientific era. This is a lot like it was in medicine and the pharmaceutical industry about 100 years ago. The first clinical trials in medicine were in 1948, and that involved randomized control trials for streptomycin to treat tuberculosis. Prior to that, there were no randomized control trials in medicine or in the pharmaceutical industry. These types of trials were regulated in the 1970s by the FDA, and it's taken about 50 years of clinical trials for the pharmaceutical industry and medicine to really be more scientific, to actually produce drugs that cure disease. Clinical trials have just begun in education, primarily funded by the IES, the Institute for Education Sciences. And just to give you an example of where we are in education, in the last, a recent study that summarized 10 years of these randomized trials in a report titled What Works in Teaching Math. They reviewed 189 studies, randomized trials in the U.S. These involved control groups or something very comparable to control groups. Out of 53 studies, separate studies, on the most popular curriculum programs in the country, none showed any evidence of effectiveness. Out of 38 studies of computer-assisted instruction, none showed any evidence of effectiveness. So what this is saying is that, in other words, modern-day curricula, which we get from vendors and make up ourselves, is not based on science. It's based on fads, intuitions, things like that. And just like medicine, it's going to take us about 50 years or so to actually introduce science in education. Some other good examples, and I'll leave this topic. States, when they do field testing for their tests, I'm involved in the testing world now, typically do not use scientific sampling. They just don't do it. I've done some workshops recently with the Council of Chief State School Officers where they just don't do it. They don't even know they're supposed to. When states and districts set standards for, like they set a proficient standard, there's often no data outside of the state used. They have no idea whether or not this standard stacks up to Massachusetts, to Finland, they have no idea. They're just simply running, they're flying without radar. So anyway, one impediment, I think, to international benchmarking, which is to look beyond your horizons, is that the whole field of education is in a pre-scientific stage. A second one, related to that, is that we're also in a pre-globalization era in education. Globalization has been embraced by many fields: medicine, health, economics, business, science, transportation industry, information industry. All of these industries realize that it's a big world out there, and you have to compete with all of these people out there. Globalization has not really permeated the American tradition of local control. And the deeper you go into the educational system, the more this is true. You also have a kind of a Lake Wobegon phenomenon. Like a district will say, well, the U.S. may have a problem, but it's not in my district. We're doing great. But again, it's because they've never actually looked beyond their horizon to see what's actually out there and who they're going to compete with. So one of the nice things about the international studies that you'll hear about today, and books like the Finnish lessons, is that they do broaden our horizons, and they do demonstrate that we should try to learn lessons from other educational systems. And you'll hear more about that today from the speakers. Just some obvious examples that you'd think would be a red flag. Canada, which is an even more decentralized country than ourselves, more diverse, spends less money on education, gets their beating the pants off of us every time an assessment is done. They're just right up the street. In fact, Ontario, I think, wasn't going to get a chance to check this, I think they were the highest achieving educational unit in the PISA result. I think. I had to check it. They're certainly among the highest. Wasn't the highest? Okay, they were among the highest. Okay. All right. It was 10. All right. I'll give you your due. Yes, and I do think it's important to do more than just take a day or two and go to Finland, to try to understand how is it that they are able to elevate the teaching profession to such an extent that you have 10 times more people applying for the job than actually get it. That's amazing. And how do the Japanese and the Asians obtain such high levels of student motivation and such a strong cultural focus on learning and education? How do they do that? I mean, the nice thing about the international studies is that they show that it can be done. They show what can be done. We may not be able to figure out yet how to do it in the U.S., but we know that it can be done because it's sitting right there in front of us and it has been done. So those are some of the context I wanted to give you. So I hope you enjoy the speakers that are coming up. Thank you.
So it's always great when we can work Lake Wobegon with an education discussion. All the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all the children are above average, but the point is very well taken. We know there's a lot of lessons out there. We have more and more evidence about what works in other countries. We may not know how to do it now, but until we get out of Lake Wobegon, we're not going to be able to start down that road. So thank you, Gary. That was a perfect way to lead into the next session here. I'm going to invite our kind of panelists for the next session to kind of come up while I give a very brief introduction. This is going to be our opportunity to bring together a really great roundtable of kind of experts from here in the U.S. and abroad who tackle education from a variety of different perspectives, have focused and are kind of part of organizations in different parts of the world. And we're going to range everywhere from a education administrator from the ministry in Ontario, which we just heard about, to a scientist at the World Bank. We have Mark Tucker from NCEE, who many of us in the room will know about, and Tony Jackson from the Asia Society. This is going to be a great group. The perspective is going to be very broad. The discussion will be deep. I won't introduce our speakers any further, but I will introduce our moderator here and let him take over the reins in just a second. If you read Education Week and have for a while, then you know Sean Cavanagh. Sean is an assistant editor at Education Week. He's been with us since 2002. Sean, right now, his primary responsibility is over state policy, so he covers all things related to governors and elections and all that fun stuff. For a long time, Sean covered math and science. We worked together actually a number of years ago on a report on evolution, which was great. If you like evolution, go back and look at it. It's still as good now as it was back in, I think, 2005, 2006. And Sean's also done a lot of coverage on the international context in math and science and otherwise, and in 2007 took a trip to China and did a lot of great reporting from there. So the panel is in very good hands, and I'd like to turn things over to Sean now.
Okay, thanks, Chris. First of all, one warning, I'm fighting a bit of a cold, so if I seem staticky, it's not the mic, it's me, but I'll power through it. Today's panel will focus on some of the broader themes we're addressing in this year's Quality Council report. What are the lessons that the United States should be taking from high-performing countries, and how easy or difficult will it be to replicate the education policies we see at work in other nations, and to what extent is that even desirable? So before we begin, let me introduce our panelists. And I'm going in no particular order, but Mary Jeanne Gallagher is the Chief Student Achievement Officer of the Province of Ontario, Canada, and an Assistant Deputy Minister with the Ontario Ministry of Education. Ontario, as you know, has received a lot of attention from U.S. officials lately. She began her career as a math teacher and has worked as a principal and superintendent, which gives her great credibility in the eyes of ed readers, I'm sure. Mark Tucker is the President and CEO of the National Center on Education and the Economy, and an internationally recognized expert on academic and occupational standards and assessment. He's also the author of numerous articles and books, most recently Surpassing Shanghai, an agenda for American education built on the world's leading systems. Emiliana Vegas is the lead economist at the Human Development Department at the World Bank, where she directs applied research on a variety of global policy issues, including teacher policies, education finance systems, early childhood, and system-wide quality assurance. She has also advised the governments of Chile and Uruguay on early childhood education policies and interventions to raise the quality of education. Tony Jackson is Vice President for Education of the Asia Society, and he leads the organization's Partnership for Global Learning, a national network dedicated to integrating knowledge about Asia and the world into American education. Tony also worked on Capitol Hill as a senior staff member on the Select Committee on Children, Youth, and Families, and he was also director of the Walt Disney Company's Disney Learning Partnership. So I'm going to begin our discussion today with a fairly broad question. which is that, in this country, we're now receiving a steady flow of information about U.S. performance on international tests. We've got the TIMS, the PIMS, and the PEARLs. We hear public officials talking about our performance all of the time, and how well or how poorly we're doing. In your view, what's the best way for a U.S. official, whether it's the U.S. Secretary of Education or a state superintendent of education, to make use of this information that's coming from abroad and have it shape policy here? Mark, do you want to offer any thoughts on that?
Sure. My one phrase answer to your question is pay attention to it. You just heard from Gary. My experience is that American educators have a list as long as my arm of reasons why this data is irrelevant, totally irrelevant. These other countries, you just said, educate just a few, and we educate everyone. There's one. The sampling procedures are clearly wrong. Let's see. The list is so long. They are totally homogeneous countries. We are very diverse. There is no truth to most of these points. But there is enough conviction among American educators that they're true, that they pay no attention at all. They really believe the experience of these other countries is irrelevant. My first answer to your question, Sean, is we have to get beyond that. These folks are eating our lunch on a matter that probably will have a greater bearing on the success of this country over the next 20 or 30 years than any other.
Mayor Jeanne, I know you're not an American official, but I'll grant you the power to answer this question. How do you think we should be what's the best way for us to be making use of this information?
I think you need to pay a lot of attention to it, but from the point of view of what are the levers that allow education to improve. It's not about the test result and trying to force everybody to a certain point in outcome. It's about where are the people from whom we can learn. So in that diverse group of organizations that are taking part in the PISA and the TIMS and so on, are some countries that are homogeneous, right? There are some jurisdictions like mine where 27% of my student population are immigrants, right? I mean, so there's enough diversity in that testing process and in those results to find people who have found some of the solutions to the system reform that brings you to greater success. And so it's not just the final test score, it's also the indications about equity. Because I'm in the same world as Finland in that I don't believe a country can economically advance when increasing proportions of its population are not able to participate in the benefits of those advancements. And as the mouse, Canada, that sleeps with the elephant, the U.S., we really need you to get it right, folks. So please pay attention to those things.
Emiliana, any thoughts?
What I would add to this is that these international assessments also give you a sense of the countries that may not be right there at the top, like Finland for the last 10, 15 years, but that are making real improvements over time. And there are lessons to learn from those that are moving toward the top that I think are
I would agree that I think we definitely need to pay very close attention to these data. But I think there's a concern I have that we begin to believe that the things these tests test are the only things that matter. I think one of the things we have to realize when you look at other countries, we went to Shanghai, for example, and talked to the Municipal Commission on Education, and they were not entirely surprised they had done well, because they said, well, this is what we've been working on for the last 10 years. But the point there is that they're not stopping there. They're thinking about what's next. And so China has an education plan for 2020, and in that they're thinking about issues of equity and issues of increasing opportunities for higher education. And Singapore, for example, has an education plan that is overtly saying that one of the things they really want to make sure that all young people develop is a sense of global awareness. And we may in this country have not embraced globalization everywhere else in the world has. And the number one thing that not the number one, but very close to the top of concerns about educators and parents in other countries is how are our kids going to be competitive within a global economy. So I think it's important, and so they are thinking about how do we have a more well-rounded education, the kind of education to a certain extent that we had in the United States that's been more narrowed as we've really honed in on testable issues. So I think we do need to pay attention, but we need to recognize that that's not the whole of what we need to be thinking about in terms of education reform, and the world is not stopping there, it's going forward. Thinking about problem solving, creativity, and so forth, these are the things that we also have to bear in mind.
I know that one of the themes we talk about in our Quality Counts report is the perils of trying to pick out a single policy from any high-performing foreign country and assuming that it can be planted in the United States and work. And Mark, you've written in your book about the idea that in many high-performing countries, it's not one policy, it's a system of policies. Can you describe, it's a coherent system of policies working together. Can you describe what you meant by that?
Well, if you listen to what Pazzi said just a few minutes ago, and think about what he said about teacher quality, what they've done in Finland, among many other things, but on this issue of teacher quality, is to greatly raise the standards for entering teacher education institutions. Greatly raise the standards. They have made sure that their compensation for teachers is roughly comparable to that for the high-status professions. They have moved teacher education from the third-tier institutions in higher education to their research universities. They have insisted that their teachers really master the subjects that they're going to teach. They have also really put a lot of emphasis on mastering their craft, and they allocate the time that is necessary for that. They have done some very shrewd things with respect to induction to make sure that they understand teaching on the ground and not just in theory. Okay, so all of those things were done under the aegis of the Finnish Ministry of Education. Look at the United States. Who makes the decisions with respect to the standards for entry into the institutions? Each institution does. Who makes the decision with respect to licensure? I left that part out in Finland, but it's a very important piece. In effect, the state has delegated that to the institutions in the United States. Who makes the decision about what teachers are paid? Each individual district does. I can go down through the list, but what you see here is, what we've seen, is that the United States, let me put it another way, I think in some ways the most serious issue we face is our extreme decentralization of education decision-making in the United States, because what Finland has done about teacher quality is just one part of a much larger framework in Finland, all the pieces of which fit together rather nicely. We don't have, at any level of our system, an institution that takes responsibility for how these pieces fit together. The result is that each institution, government, non-government, or semi-government in the United States, does what it can within the limits of its authority and responsibility, which are very circumscribed. And so we basically keep making minor changes in an institutional picture that's 100 years out of date. You heard what Pazzi said. All of this has been done in the frame of a very few decades. It wasn't by accident. They had an institution in their society that took responsibility, in effect, for making this happen, learning how to do it and execute it. Looked at from the point of view of the countries that have had the most success, it's not that the United States has a bad system. We have no system. No, it's a serious remark. The parts and pieces do not fit together. If a school of education, I'm sure Sharon would agree, if the school of education in the United States chose to raise its standards the way Finland has done, it would be out of business. Because if you can't raise salaries to attract the people for whom it would be worthwhile, you're not going to get people coming into that institution. We have to find a way in the United States to overcome this governance problem, to get the parts and pieces working like this instead of like this,
Let me ask you, Emiliana, because at the World Bank, you've been building a knowledge base of key features across education systems in high-performing countries. Can you give us a synopsis of what you found in terms of some of the characteristics of these high-performing nations?
Sure. Some of the things that Mark is talking about is some of the lessons. It's the alignment between the different parts of the education system. And in our knowledge base that you're referring to, what we're looking at specifically is policy. So we're looking less at the outcomes. We're taking that information from PISA and TIMSS, and then looking, honing in at what are these high-performing, and can we draw some patterns? And some of the patterns we're seeing is that there really is no one recipe that they all do in the same way. So even when you look at Finland and Singapore and Korea, you could argue that some of the things that Pasi talked about how they manage teachers in Finland, is very different from Korea, where it's much more directed by the government, where teachers may be expected to deliver in the same way in all the schools at the same time, much differently than in Finland. And yet, I think one of the common things is that they all do motivate teachers. They do seem to attract really highly talented individuals into the profession. And in the cases that they can't yet afford to do that, they support them intensively. And so there's this underlying, I think, intention of the system as a whole to deliver results for all kids. And I think that's the main difference that distinguishes high-performing countries from those that aren't achieving. It's that if you are focused on each and every child learning at the highest potential, then the system provides resources differentially, provides support differentially to teachers, to different schools, and really is ensuring that all kids learn.
Well, one of the criticisms of the U.S. system that we hear, and there have been reports and studies on this, is that some of the most highly effective teachers aren't often sent to work in the schools that need it the most. And you found that in a lot of high-performing countries, they allocate their teacher talent differently. Isn't that right?
In a lot of the high-performing countries, there's a requirement for teachers as they are proven to be more effective, that they have, I don't know if it's 10,000 hours or how many hours of experience, but really to become master teachers and help others learn that craft. And they're specifically allocated to those schools that need the most talented teachers, so that kids who are at the most disadvantaged aren't also, like in other countries that don't achieve very high results, getting the newer teachers, the ones with the least experience, getting high turnover of their teaching staffs. And so we see that common pattern between the low and high performing that's quite different in how they assign teachers to different schools and different students.
And Mary Jeanne, I wanted to get your input on this because Ontario has received a lot of credit recently for managing to raise expectations for the teaching profession while also avoiding some of these high decibel fights that we've had in the United States over collective bargaining, evaluation, pay, job protections. Can you describe how Ontario has gone about this and what the U.S. might learn from your experience?
Yeah, first of all, our criteria, while not a master's degree to enter into the teaching profession, the criteria to gain entry into our teaching faculty is in fact, and has been for quite some time, fairly high. If you're going to be teaching, particularly in middle or secondary school, you need that subject competence, etc., in a university degree before you go into your teacher training, or you must do it concurrently. So it hasn't been so much a focus on the entry, as it has been a real focus on understanding that if you're going to change the quality of learning for students, that's only going to happen when you work with teachers to change the quality of teaching. And you best change the quality of teaching by working with your teachers. Ontario came through some very different political times. In the 90s, people in our province were quite dissatisfied with our schools. We saw people moving into the private school system. We were characterized by any number of strikes and difficulties with teacher unions and other educational unions. It was a pretty, and the provincial government and in Canada there's not a national system of education, there are provincial systems of education, but the provincial ministers talk to each other. And notwithstanding the fact that there's not a national system, the provincial systems are pretty closely aligned. But essentially in Ontario in the 90s, our public had become very dissatisfied with our school system and with the rancor and the difficulty that was associated there. We had a new government elected in 2002-03 that was elected on the basis of improving our school system. But they did it with a commitment to working with teachers and understanding that teachers are professionals and that, you know, almost without exception, any teacher you ever meet really wants to see their kids do well and succeed. The issue becomes, how do you go about doing that? So we start from a point of view of believing that if things are not improving in a particular classroom, it's not because the teacher can't improve, it's not because the children can't learn. It's because they don't know everything they need to know yet in order to make that happen. And so a lot of our investment in the last while has been working with our teacher unions, with our frontline teachers and school leaders to build capacity in the schools to be able to deliver better outcomes, while at the same time talking about the fact that we need to build public confidence in education, that having public confidence in your education system is the air we breathe, that that's how you end up with a population that's willing to continue to support that with their tax dollars.
I wanted to move from teacher policy for a second to sort of a broader theme, and it came up in our reporting and quality counts. But Tony, you've talked about how in a lot of top-scoring Asian countries, it's not only a lot of in-school policies that make a difference, but they also seem to have this culture of continuous improvement, as you called it. What do you mean by that, and what lessons do you think the United States could learn from that system?
I want to answer that question, but before I do, I kind of just want to comment on something that's been said a couple of times before. This issue of equity, I think, is permeating the discussion, and I guess one of the things that I think that we need to sort of grapple with is that we're talking sort of so far now about kind of technical ways of dealing with equity, but there's a larger question in this country we have to ask is whether or not we believe in equity. I see in Finland and I see in other countries there's a cultural belief in the fact that we're going to educate every kid to very, very high standards. And we sort of at some point need to call the question on ourselves and ask, you know, do we really have that will to do that? I mean, I think until we begin to have these discussions about kind of class and race and so forth to go along with technical issues, I think we're not quite there yet. So that's a bit of a comment that we would come back to. But in terms of the implementation piece, you know, it's interesting when you go when you hear about a Finland or you go to Singapore, it's like it's going to places where ideas born in the United States go to grow up. And you sort of see interesting things all through Singapore that, oh, I remember that from my textbook, yeah. But what you see in these places at the very top is a real sort of aligned set of institutions at the top level between, for example, the Ministry of Education and a research arm that is sort of directly connected to implementing policy. So in Korea you have the Korean Education Development Institute, or better even kind of example I know more about is the relationship between the National Institute of Education in Singapore and the Ministry of Education. So for example, in the pre-1990s, there was a teacher shortage in Singapore. So in the spirit of what they think of as sort of dreaming, designing, and delivering in Singapore, the ministry, in effect, just dreamed up and thought about a policy that would support the development of teachers, development of tracks for different levels of teachers and career ladders and so forth. And then the National Institute of Education was the implementing arm of that. And so in this instance, they do educate every teacher in Singapore. But the idea, though, is that there's a tight coupling between policy and practice in schools. And then it sort of permeates down within the system so that teachers, as was constantly saying, become instrumentalities of implementation. They are researchers, and schools are more and more in Singapore particularly, they're trying to have them be centers of innovation where not only interesting things happen, but there's a system, particularly through teacher professional development and teacher networks, that those innovations can be disseminated broadly. So every school, more and more, is becoming a place where not only good teaching is going on, but good research and good collaborative passing around of ideas is happening. So you have kind of you do have a culture of implementation from the very top through what happens at the school level.
I wanted to get back to the issue of equity, because we heard Pasi talk earlier about how all these international measures, poverty seems to matter less to student performance in Finland. That is also true in Canada. And one of the explanations, that's been put forward for that is you have a very different system of school finance in most of your provinces. In Ontario, for instance, you do more to equalize funding across school districts. And can you describe that system, how it works, and what the potential benefits and if there are any drawbacks, what those are?
Our funding system and all of the funding for education is provided through the provincial government. So for starters, it all comes provincially, and that's been a change since the 90s as well. But in that funding formula, and it's like Finland, it's a fairly complex formula. But essentially, there is a fixed amount of funding for every student that comes. And then you get additional funding if you are a remote and rural community or a very small school, et cetera, and you have greater overhead costs. You would get additional funding based to some degree on the socioeconomic and language barriers present within your school community. You would get additional funding for a number of things. The division of the ministry that I work with, actually, we allocate our funding not based on poverty and so on. We allocate funding to teacher and principal capacity building to the 72 school districts across the province based on outcomes. But it's based on the notion of, we know that if a school district or a set of schools are struggling, we need to resource them more and support them more, not just with funding, but with assistance in terms of building that collaborative network with schools in their area, et cetera. So the funding formula has various levers within it that are designed to equalize the support or to provide support so that you can better achieve equity in terms of outcomes for your kids.
I actually wanted to draw some threads of this conversation together around a question that Tony just asked, having to do with equity. If you were a country, if you were running a country that was actually committed to getting all students up to globally benchmarked standards, what would you do? You would look at the kids in your society, and you would first of all realize that they're coming to school very differently equipped to take advantage of the formal education that begins in the first grade in school, and so you would do everything you could to fix that. As we look at the top performers, that is what they've done. They've worked really hard on equalizing, in effect, the opportunities that kids have neonatal through first grade of school. That's the first thing you would do. The second thing you would do once the kids come to school is make sure that the funding is distributed in such a way that kids who are harder to bring up to your chosen standard would get more resources than those for whom it was easier. That's what these countries are doing. The third thing you would do is make sure that there are essentially two crucial resources in education. One is money and the other is teachers, right? So the third thing that these countries are doing, you'll see it right across the board, is, first of all, educating their teachers to a high standard, but making sure that those teachers are equally distributed and that the kids who are having the most trouble have first dibs on the best teachers. That's the third thing you would do. The fourth thing that you would do is make sure that if kids started to fall off the boat as they went through the curriculum from the very first grade to the end of common school, somebody caught that quick and did something about it. So one of the things that you see going on in these countries, in their schools of education, is a lot more attention to diagnosis and prescription. That is, finding a problem with the kids early and fixing it fast with the best research knowledge that's available. That's one reason that most of these countries are moving teacher education out of third-tier institutions and into research universities so that they understand the research, know how to use it, and can generate it. All of these things, these are not independent from each other. Your first question to me was about the system. If you're serious about building an equitable system, this is what the system looks like. These countries are doing these things in very different ways. They're not all the same. They don't all look like Finland. Some of them look very different. But each one of the things I just talked about, they're doing in one way or another. It's systems thinking. It's what we don't do.
I wanted to ask a pretty broad question here, and I'll pose this to Emiliana, but the rest of you can jump in as well. One of the main questions that always comes out whenever we have a new round of PISA and TIMSS test scores is, well, why does this matter from an economic standpoint? I mean, to what extent is educational prowess connected with the nation's economic growth over time? What has your research told you about that in terms of what you see from abroad, and what are the implications here?
So we, and my colleagues at the bank as well as researchers, throughout the world have been looking at this question. And before PISA and TIMSS and these tests were available, what we had was, do more years of schooling relate to growth or, expansions of systems? And there was indications that they did. And so there was a big movement to invest in more years of schooling. But now that we have better information about what kind of the skills that the population has, it's becoming even more clear that it's really the skills that matter. So it's not years per se. And so schooling systems that don't deliver on the skills are generating a disadvantage that is going to take years to overcome, because it's reflected not only in individual wages and productivity, but more broadly, like you say, in the wealth of a nation and its opportunities to grow. And we all know that companies will settle in countries like, when Nokia is looking to expand, or it looked at Costa Rica because it was one of the few countries that had skilled labor force. Other companies look at countries that can have the ability to produce the workers that they need. And we also know for this country, I think, from the research that Richard Renane and Frank Levy have done from Harvard and MIT, that the skills that companies are demanding have changed dramatically over time. So we no longer have strong manufacturing industry that requires basically a high school degree or just a college degree, but more and more it's a knowledge economy where people need to have complex thinking skills, as they call them, and that requires a whole different type of education system, a way of learning how to think, and not just learning facts.
I wanted to jump in on that, and I was struck when Gary was talking about his analysis that in U.S. schools you had not yet entered into the world of scientific approach to things and a research and evidence-based culture to improvement in the schools, and you hadn't yet entered into the globalization era. And I was actually quite stunned by those comments, because the school system that I lead certainly has, and I know Finland has, and a number of the people that we talk to about how we learn from each other inside Ontario and outside of Ontario actually have done that. And paying attention to those things is one of the ways in which you do that. There's another myth about those international results. That's partially true, as most myths are, but and that is that they're narrow, and admittedly they test reading and math and science. Reading and math in particular, and being capable in those things, are not the only things we want our school system to do. But they're really important first things that we have to get right in schools if our kids are going to be able to move on into the kind of learning on the broader basis, both in terms of character education and globalized citizenship, but also in terms of all of those other 21st century capabilities. So we need to pay attention to those things and the lessons we can learn from each other, because it is, in fact, the scientific principle, isn't it? It's what you need to do at every level of your school system. The classroom teacher needs to pay attention to all of the evidence and research they can find that helps them unlock the kids of mystery that they haven't moved along yet. The school principal needs to emphasize that in their best craft. School districts need to do that, and so does your overall school system.
Tony, I know that you've done some research on Singapore, and in fact they've tried to reshape their education system to meet the workforce needs through the vocational education, the building of a vocational education system. Can you describe what they've done and what you see other high-performing Asian jurisdictions have done in that area?
I think in general what you see in Asian countries, and probably, I know most of Asian countries, but in other countries as well, is a clear recognition of the absolute connection between education and economic growth, and that they really do have to find a way to make sure that every young person contributes to the economy in some way. So there is this huge devotion to human capital development. In fact, there's an elementary school in Singapore called the Tampines Elementary, and I wanted to get this right. This is their motto. They said they want all their pupils to be enriched beyond limits and loved beyond measure. And so with that kind of mantra, there's a very tight connection between the Ministry of Education and the Manpower Ministry and the Economic Development Board. And so one of the ways in which that has translated is in a complete revamping of their vocational education system into the development of the Institutes for Technical Education. And basically, this is an idea that came from the Economic Development Board in the 1990s. The goal was essentially twofold. One is to actually attract industry to Singapore, so they wanted to have the workforce be available for that. But the other was to create a pathway, a viable pathway, a high prestige pathway for young people who are at the lower end of the achievement scale, if you will, to still have a viable entry into the workplace. And so they completely redesigned the coursework for within vocational education to make it much more relevant to current industries. They brought industry people in to be the teachers and internships and so forth. And they sort of consolidated the number of different campuses they had into 3 mega campuses, one of which we visited, and it's of a class at any one of our great universities, frankly. I mean, it has the look and feel and spirit of a tremendously developmental institution. And so the result of all that is that there's about 25% of the population of school kids after the first 10 years of schooling in Singapore go on to the ITE. And after coming out of the ITE, there's a 90% employment rate afterwards. And the youth unemployment in Singapore is the lowest in the world, I think, or certainly close to it. So they've really sort of made a very clear decision that there are industries that need to be supported, and we do that in a way that raises the prestige of vocational education and gives people skills that are 21st century skills that they actually translate into work within the economy.
Mark, I know that you've looked at this issue over the years. If the United States doesn't increase its education performance, what implications do you see in the long term for economic growth? I know that's a hopelessly broad question.
It's broad, and let me just hit a few highlights, and I hope I'll do this in a way you can follow it. Until very recently, and I'm speaking globally, until very recently, most people in most countries in the workforce competed with other people in the same country. And countries can arrange their economies, or have them arranged by fate, so that people who, with relatively little education in a country, can do pretty well, while somebody who has a lot more education does better, but the income distribution is not great. The Scandinavian countries are a good example of such countries. Because of the advance of technology, primarily computer-driven technology, and the globalization of labor markets, that's not true anymore. Highly educated people are now competing not just with highly educated people in their own country, they're competing with highly educated people all over the world. The same thing for people with a middle level skill, and the same for people with low skills. That is a frightening thing for countries with high wage scales, because it means you people in this audience, are now competing, very highly skilled people with highly skilled people in countries who charge much less for their highly skilled services. Same thing for middle, same thing for low. What this is doing, because of the advance of technology and globalization, is two things. It's putting the standard of living in wealthy countries at risk, and it is producing a much higher correlation between what you know and what you're paid. And that is driving income distribution in the developed countries apart. The people with the highest incomes are making more and more relative to the people with the lowest incomes. There's things that countries can do about that by policy, but it's limited because we're now in one integrated global labor market. Because that's true, this is not 20 years ago, it's not 30 years ago, it's not 40 years ago, it's now and it's different. And what it means is that the education challenge for countries that have high wage scales is totally different than what it was 30 years ago. That's why Finland changed the system in the way that Pasi described. What people in this country need to understand is that that applies to us just as much as it applies to Finland or any other country. And what it essentially means, if we want elite wages on a global wage scale, we have to be educating our entire country to elite skills. We've never had to do that before. It is a total transformation in the education requirement. And there is a giant job in educating the American people who don't understand that the challenge we face in economic terms is totally different than the one they went to school. That's what's at stake.
Thank you. I think I'm now going to turn this over to the audience for some questions, as well as folks who are online. So we've got a mic, and just raise your hand, and we'll send the mic your way. And please, if you could give your name and your affiliation.
Amanda Brown with Public Education Network. I want to go back to a couple of comments that were made. Mary Jeanne, you talked about public confidence in the education system in Ontario and the importance of continuing to have public support so people would pay tax dollars in order to support education there. And Tony, of course, you raised the question of whether we really have the commitment to educate all, which I think is a challenge for raising that public commitment for public education. What lessons can we learn? What in Ontario perhaps happened to pay special attention to increasing public confidence, to reaching out beyond parents of public school kids so that everyone understood the value of education? Was it a deliberate strategy? And beyond Ontario, are there lessons from other countries that we can learn, because that's such a crisis here, and a lack of public confidence and public support for public education beyond parents?
For starters, in Ontario, yes, it was a deliberate strategy. And the first part of it I describe as the children in our lives are never advantaged when the adults in their lives are fighting. And that's true in a home, and it's especially true in their school and in their school systems. So the public and parents don't have confidence in an education system in which the dialogue between all of the partners in the system is more like hurling rocks across the fence, right? So part of this is about saying we need to change the way in which we talk to each other inside the school system, and that the Ministry of Education needs to be a partner with districts and a partner with teachers and principals in delivering on that promise that every child can learn, and that a school system needs to be positioned to be able to provide the best future for every one of those children. Then you actually have to, once you change that dialogue and you've made that commitment, work diligently in the ways in which you can deliver on this promise, but do it in a partnership as well. And so that requires some financial support and some investment. I think it also requires a real understanding of what the reality in a classroom is. Every teacher and every principal I've ever seen are so brutally busy. They don't have time to do the best educational research, and they don't always have time to do that kind of collaborative sharing that's going to allow them to improve their practice. They need time to be able to do that, but even more importantly, they need some help in being able to organize that. So that was part of the deliberate strategy that was established in creating the Student Achievement Division of our ministry. We actually have a research capacity internally and the ability to commission research. We pay attention to that great research that's going on in American and a whole bunch of other universities, but some of the best things we do in our schools come from American educational research, folks. We just look really hard and long at how we can work with our staffs to implement that. And then we look for places in which, in Ontario, teachers and principals are doing that. We videotape it, we provide the PD resources that can be widely shared. We start from the point of view that it's our job to help people understand those new ways. And the other comment I'd make is we don't look for the program in a box that's the magical solution to everything in education. We understand it has to be a system. And it has to be a system in which you build up the capacity of teachers. I have about 120,000 classrooms in which it's my responsibility to improve teaching and learning every day. You can mandate and top-down regulate adequacy. You have to inspire excellence.
Okay.
I had a comment.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to add, and maybe you can comment on that, but I think one of the things that has helped in the countries that I worked in that have embarked in these kind of efforts to build public confidence, or that has happened for some, there's always been a crisis that generates that need. So I think in Finland, what pushed sort of reforms was the need to improve the economy, and the poverty rate extended. I think in Canada, there was a similar crisis that made it to happen. And I wonder if part of the Lake Wabagan problem in the U.S. is that the individual families are still content with the quality of the public schools that their kids are attending to some extent, and to a limiting extent of those who have left the system, realizing that that's not going to serve them either.
Well, and I know that this is something we talk about in our report. Periodically in American education, we've had these periods where there's been all of a sudden, a lot of public concern about foreign competition. After Sputnik, for instance, after A Nation at Risk came out, but it's really debatable whether that trickled down throughout the entire education system in the U.S. So I'll go to the next question. I think we have one over here.
Thank you. Jane West with the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education. My question's about what you're observing in terms of the role of the private sector in promoting improvement in public education. As you well know, our country, there seems to be a real focus on entrepreneurship, almost a venture capital sort of notion, and it sometimes appears that there's an effort almost to establish a separate system through charter schools, through alternate routes to teaching, through some of the online programs, some of the for-profit, higher ed. But I just wonder if there is a parallel internationally, and if you have seen examples of a private entrepreneurial sort of effort that has been effective in lifting all boats.
I would answer your question in the negative. I have yet to encounter, we've been doing research on the top performing countries for 22 years now. We've yet to find the top performing countries in which there is a belief among anybody that we have talked to that the way to reform their system is to empower young people with little experience to take on big tasks in education and reform it from the outside. It strikes people as bizarre. I'm serious. It strikes people as bizarre. Again, I'll come back to the point I was making earlier. It doesn't strike people as bizarre in a country like ours, in which many people feel something has to change and they don't see levers for changing it, and they see the blob, as one of our former secretaries of education put it, in control of the enterprise. So for them, it seems somehow logical to leave the blob in place, but to try and subvert it from the outside. In these other countries, as I said earlier, there's actually a ministry that's responsible for the education system, and so the ministry is held to account for running an effective system. So if the system is not effective, the response is not to undermine it. That's what strikes people as so bizarre. The response is to change it. So it is responsive. So it improves. We have a totally different mindset. It is as if we were complicit in having given up on the system and on changing it. Mm-hmm. And so we've adopted the view that the best we can do is nibble around the edges. This idea that we can somehow destroy the system by creating something outside of it. That is nowhere in evidence in any country we have ever visited that has achieved success.
Okay, I think we're going to go to an online question from the online audience, so go ahead.
Yeah, there seems to be a lot of interest about teacher evaluation. I know we asked Posse about this last, but one of our live stream chatters is asking, looking at some of these high-performing countries, how are the teachers evaluated there? What are lessons that we can learn from that? And, more specifically, how are the master teachers identified?
I need to speak to that.
Ontario does have a fulsome teacher evaluation process that takes place in terms of a principal's responsibility to evaluate teachers in their schools. A teacher's evaluation outcome is not in any way linked to PISA tests or our internal Ontario standards tests that take place in grade 3, 6, 9, and 10. A teacher's role is a fairly broad and complex thing. It seems to me that the only logical place to evaluate it is, in fact, in the school, in the relationship between the principal and the teacher. And your evaluation process, I would submit, needs to be transparent. It needs to be based in the roots of what good pedagogy looks like. And when you identify a teacher that's struggling to improve, it needs to include in it a large commitment to helping that teacher learn to do and be better before you go to the, oh, well, let's just change that. I mean, good teachers take a lot to develop, and it takes a long time and experience in a teacher's practice to get where you really want them to be. And you don't just want the master teachers to be there, you want everyone to be there. So you have to walk that talk in your teacher evaluation process as well.
Okay. Got another question in the audience?
Oh, sorry, I'm Larry Fondrick from National Assessment Governing Board. I wanted to ask about a factor nobody mentioned. What are the factors, what can you learn from high-performing countries? But nobody mentioned the computer-assisted instruction. That wasn't mentioned in any of them. I mean, Mark Tucker talked about the computer leading to globalization and employment, changes in wage structures. But I just wondered, maybe the person from the World Bank might talk about that. What evidence is there at all that computer-assisted instruction is in any way related to improvement in these high-performing countries?
The evidence.
Mark says none.
I was going to say it's very thin and mixed, and there are some recent randomized controlled trials underway that, but they still have contradictory findings. So I don't, our conclusion at the World Bank, we have a small program trying to continue to study it and to work with it, because the way we see it is that it's inevitable that schools will move toward using more computers. And that probably they should, because the world is changing in that direction and has changed in that direction. However, it's not, it's another tool that teachers have at their disposal. It's not a substitute, and it's not a solution in and of itself. It's how it's used, how it's employed, and it will vary. It's in fact, as the research is showing, varies depending on the quality of the teachers. It's almost everything.
In the countries you look at, are they using technology more in the towards the goal of providing basic access to education, say to rural, undeveloped areas, or is it more at a higher level?
It seems to me that what we've learned is more for performing countries like Korea, that's increasingly using technology to facilitate access to textbooks, to materials, to high-level materials. Less to substitute for teachers, although there are, I think in the international development field, for large countries like India or China, particularly India, that's still a sort of low-income country with a lot of rural and high-density population. How do you reach all these children? Where you still have, so they're exploring the idea of how do you get at least the example of excellent teaching to at least reach those teachers, but not yet to reach the kids.
Next question. This gentleman.
Hi, my name is David Goldstein. I'm from the Data Quality Campaign. And Emiliana mentioned that a crisis sometimes precipitates change. I feel like we've had crises, large crises in the last couple of years in this country, especially in education, finance, and we seem resilient to any kind of change despite the level of crises. So my question deals with finance and educational finance. There are those who have studied finance that argue that our system is very disconnected between a link between finance and performance and outcomes, and we do have a lot of factors that complicate the way funding relates to schools and prevents schools from making decisions on how to spend their money. And that seems like a very big equity issue in many of the studies that we've read. So can you comment on, can the panel comment on experience internationally on how finance systems promote the kind of equity that you're talking about? Or don't?
Well, it is, as we were saying earlier, you see a general pattern in these countries of assuming that the job is to get all kids to quite high standards. In this country, that's a slogan, but in those countries, it's actually an objective. And so, as I was saying earlier, because it's an objective, they actually sit down and plan how they're going to do it. And it is clear to the planners in most of those countries that you're not going to do it if you're providing more resources to the most advantaged kids and less resources to the least advantaged kids, because there is in those circumstances no way at all that you're going to be able to get the kids who are hardest to educate up to the same standards you're expecting more advantaged kids to get to. So it is a premise of funding in most, not all, of the high-performing countries that you provide more resources to kids who need more resources in order to get to high standards than those who are lower. They do it in different ways. Most of the systems that they use are variations on a pupil-weighted financing scheme, for those of you who are into the school finance jargon, which simply means that in those countries, they predicate a certain amount of money which goes to all students, and then they add a weight to the amount of money that goes behind students who have various characteristics. So, for example, students from, in some countries with, whose parents have very low education levels, in other countries who come from low-income families, in other countries who don't speak the native language at home. And I don't mean that these are alternatives. I mean in various countries they combine these as different weighting factors, right? The formulas differ from country to country. The things that are taken into account differ. You heard earlier that one of the factors in Finland is whether they live in remote places where it's much more expensive for all the reasons that Pasi mentioned to educate those kids. Same thing happens, by the way, in Sweden, where they have the same problem, in a number of other Scandinavian countries, and so on. So the basic point is they are variations on a pupil-weighted financing system. Financing is a really important part of the picture.
Paul, do we have another question?
Yeah.
Audience?
Okay, APEC Ed asks, if the U.S. education system is such a failure, well, why is it that the country has such a high productivity rate?
The economists in the panel, have any thoughts on that?
Oh man, this is such an interesting question. I refer you, by the way, to an article in the current Washington Monthly, which I found absolutely fascinating. I read a couple of days ago. It is a piece by a person very qualified to talk about these matters, who believes that our productivity rate is actually about half of what most people in this country think it is for measurement reasons. And for those of you, there may be one or two in this audience who are interested in such things, I highly recommend that article. It's not clear that our productivity rate is what we think it is, but assume for the moment that it is. There are several points that come to bear. If you make a change in education policy in any country, it will be probably 20 years before that change is reflected in the economic capacity of the workforce in productivity terms. So people are constantly saying, if X is true, how come Y is true in the education system? The answer is there's an enormous lag time. That's one of the things that is going on here. So what you're seeing in the American system now is a product of decisions we made, policies we put in place, or didn't 20 years ago. What you're seeing globally in the statistics from PISA is that in that period, one country after another is overtaking us in education. So you have to keep the time lag in mind. You need also to realize that one of the keys of success in the United States in terms of the quality of our workforce is that to a significant extent after the Second World War and for a considerable period of time, We benefited enormously from people coming to this country from all over the world in our graduate schools and staying here. At the time of the dot-com revolution, fully 1/4 of the people who were top technology officers in the Silicon Valley were from India. 1/4. We're not benefiting from that anymore because, for two reasons, our immigration policy has changed, and it's much more attractive to a lot of those people to come here to our graduate schools now and then go right back to the country they came from where they can make a whole lot more money. So the picture is changing, and we shouldn't expect the relative productivity advantage that we had 10 or 20 years ago to continue. We don't have a lock on that, and we're not doing now what we need to do to have a productivity advantage in the future that we've had in the past.
Okay, I think that's all the time we have, unfortunately. These folks will be around if you want to corner them and ask them some of the questions we didn't have time for, but I want to thank our panelists.